The old freight wagon groaned to a halt outside Copper Ridge, Arizona, its wheels carving deep ruts in the sun-baked earth. Dust clouds billowed around the contraption as if the desert itself was exhaling after holding its breath. From the wagon's weathered bed, a young man climbed down with careful, deliberate movements, his clothes bearing the telltale signs of a journey that had lasted far too long. Marcus Chen adjusted the brim of his worn hat and turned toward the wagon's cargo. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. A child's wail pierced the afternoon silence, sharp and desperate, echoing off the canyon walls that embraced the small frontier town. The sound made several townspeople pause in their daily routines, heads turning toward the disturbance with expressions ranging from curiosity to annoyance. Behind Marcus, tied to the wagon with a frayed rope that had seen better days, stood the most stubborn mule anyone in Copper Ridge had ever laid eyes on. The animal's gray coat was matted with trail dust, its ears pinned back in permanent irritation, and its dark eyes held a glint that suggested it would rather kick down a barn than cooperate with any human endeavor. The mule had a name, though Marcus rarely used it anymore. Jasper had earned his reputation for obstinacy during their 3-week journey from California, refusing to move when he pleased and moving too fast when he didn't. The crying intensified as Marcus reached into the wagon bed, his movements gentle despite the urgency of the situation. He lifted a small bundle wrapped in a faded blue blanket, revealing a red-faced boy of perhaps 18 months. The child's dark hair was damp with perspiration, his tiny fists clenched as he continued his protest against the world in general and their current circumstances in particular. Marcus bounced the boy gently, his voice a low murmur of comfort that barely carried over the crying. The child was his nephew Tommy, though the boy had no memory of his real parents. Marcus had become the only family Tommy had ever known after a fever took his sister and her husband the previous winter. The responsibility weighed on Marcus like a stone in his chest, especially during moments like these when nothing he did seemed to calm the distressed child. The wagon driver, a grizzled man named Pete who chewed tobacco with the dedication of a religious practice, spat into the dust and shook his head. His weathered face bore the permanent squint of someone who had spent decades staring into the sun, and his patience had clearly reached its limits several miles back. "End of the line, boy," Pete announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had made this declaration countless times before. "Copper Ridge is as far as this wagon goes. You got business here, or you just passing through like tumbleweed?" Marcus shifted Tommy to his other arm, the child's weight familiar but challenging after hours of holding him during the bumpy ride. The boy's crying had subsided to intermittent whimpering, though his lower lip trembled with the promise of renewed wailing at any moment. "Looking for work," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the uncertainty gnawing at his insides. "Heard there might be ranches hereabouts that could use an extra hand." Pete's laugh was more of a bark than an expression of humor. He gestured toward the main street of Copper Ridge, which consisted of perhaps a dozen buildings arranged with the haphazard planning typical of frontier settlements. The structures seemed to lean against each other for support, their wooden facades bleached pale by the relentless Arizona sun. "Work's scarce as hen's teeth around here, especially for a man traveling with a young'un and that devil of a mule," Pete observed, nodding toward Jasper, who had chosen that moment to bray loudly, as if announcing his presence to anyone who might have missed it. "Most folks got enough troubles of their own without taking on someone else's." Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a few coins, the remainder of what little money he had managed to save before leaving California. The metallic clink sounded pathetically small in the vast emptiness of the desert landscape. He handed the fare to Pete, who counted it twice before tucking it away with the practiced efficiency of someone who trusted no one when it came to money. "Much obliged for the ride," Marcus said, stepping back as Pete prepared to turn the wagon around. The driver paused, his expression softening slightly as he looked at Marcus and the child. "Piece of advice, son," Pete said, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "There's a spread about 10 miles northwest of here. The Cross Creek Ranch, run by a man named Jake Sullivan. Lost his foreman last month when the fool got himself kicked by a bronco. Sullivan's been working short-handed ever since." Pete paused, spitting again before continuing. He's a hard man, but fair. Might give you a chance if you can prove you're worth the trouble. Marcus nodded his gratitude, filing the information away as Pete cracked his whip and guided the wagon back toward the main road. The sound of wheels and hoofbeats gradually faded, leaving Marcus alone in the settling dust with Tommy and Jasper. The mule regarded him with what could only be described as smugness, as if it knew exactly how precarious their situation had become. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and Tommy's whimpering was escalating toward another full-blown crying fit. Marcus looked around Copper Ridge, taking in the handful of businesses that comprised the town's commercial district. A general store stood next to a saloon, while a small church anchored the far end of the street. Somewhere among these buildings, he hoped to find directions to the Cross Creek Ranch, and perhaps a kind soul willing to provide information about Jake Sullivan. The general store seemed like the most logical place to start gathering information, so Marcus shouldered his travel pack and began walking toward it, Jasper trailing reluctantly behind. The mule's hooves clip-clopped against the hard-packed earth with irregular rhythm, punctuated by occasional snorts of displeasure. Tommy had settled into a steady grumble, his small hands grasping at Marcus's shirt, as if anchoring himself against an uncertain world. The store's wooden steps creaked under Marcus's boots as he climbed to the covered porch. Through the dusty windows, he could see shelves lined with goods and the silhouette of someone moving behind the counter. He tied Jasper's lead rope to a post, ignoring the mule's immediate attempt to chew on the rough wood, and pushed open the door. A small bell announced his arrival with a cheerful jingle that seemed oddly optimistic given his circumstances. Behind the counter stood a woman of perhaps 40 years, her graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, and her dress covered by a serviceable apron. She looked up from her ledger book with the kind of expression reserved for unexpected visitors, curious but guarded. Her eyes immediately went to Tommy, who had chosen that moment to emit a particularly loud wail. "Afternoon," Marcus said, raising his voice to be heard over the child's protests. "I'm looking for information about work in the area, specifically the Cross Creek Ranch." The woman's eyebrows rose slightly, and she set down her pencil with deliberate care. Her gaze moved from Marcus to Tommy and then to the window, where Jasper was visible in his ongoing battle with the hitching post. "That your mule out there trying to eat my porch?" she asked, her tone suggesting this was not the first time livestock had caused property damage in Copper Ridge. "Yes, ma'am. Name's Jasper, and he's got opinions about most everything," Marcus replied, bouncing Tommy in what he hoped was a soothing manner. "I'm Marcus Chen, and this here's Tommy. We're traveling through, looking for honest work." The woman studied them for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Outside, Jasper had given up on the post and was now investigating a water trough with suspicious interest, as if questioning its motives. "Martha Winters," she said finally, extending a work-hardened hand. "I run this store with my husband Frank. Cross Creek Ranch, you said? That's Jake Sullivan's place. Good man, though he's been having a rough time of it lately." Marcus shook her hand, grateful for the first friendly gesture he had encountered since arriving in Copper Ridge. Tommy had momentarily stopped crying, perhaps lulled by the relative coolness of the store's interior, though his eyes remained red and watery from his earlier distress. "What kind of rough time?" Marcus asked, genuinely concerned. He had learned during his travels that understanding a potential employer's difficulties often provided insight into available opportunities. Martha glanced toward the window as if checking to ensure they would not be overheard, then leaned forward slightly. Her voice dropped to the conspiratorial tone that small-town residents used when discussing their neighbor's business. "Lost his wife about 2 years back," she said quietly. "Emma Sullivan was as fine a woman as ever drew breath, and her passing hit Jake harder than a bucking bronco. Then his foreman, Bill Carter, got himself hurt bad last month. Compound fracture in his leg that's going to keep him laid up for months, if he ever works again at all." She paused, studying Marcus with the calculating gaze of someone who had spent years evaluating the character of strangers. Tommy had begun to fuss again, his small voice building toward another crescendo of displeasure. "Jake's been trying to run that spread with just 2 regular hands and whatever day labor he can find in town," Martha continued. "But most of the available men around here are either too old, too young, or too fond of spending their evenings in the saloon to be much use on a working ranch." Marcus shifted Tommy to his other arm, the child's weight seeming to increase with each passing minute. Through the window, he could see Jasper had discovered a patch of grass growing near the store's foundation and was methodically destroying it with the thoroughness of a locust swarm. "Think you might be willing to talk to someone like me?" Marcus asked, trying to keep the desperation out of his voice. "I've got experience with cattle and horses, and I'm willing to work hard." Martha's gaze moved pointedly to Tommy, who had resumed his crying with renewed vigor. The sound echoed off the store's walls, making conversation increasingly difficult. "Jake's not much for children," she said bluntly. "Never had any of his own. And since Emma passed, he's become something of a hermit. Speaks only when spoken to, keeps to himself, and runs that ranch like it's the only thing keeping him tethered to this world." The bell above the door jingled again as another customer entered, bringing with him the smell of leather and horse sweat. The newcomer was a tall man with sun-weathered skin and the bow-legged gait of someone who spent more time in the saddle than on foot. He nodded politely to Martha before his attention was drawn to Marcus and the crying child. "Afternoon, Mrs. Winters," the man said, his voice carrying the easy authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "That's quite a pair of lungs on that little fellow." Martha smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth Marcus had seen since entering the store. "Tom Bradley, meet Marcus Chen and young Tommy here. They're asking about work at the Cross Creek Ranch." Tom Bradley removed his hat, revealing thinning hair the color of sand, and extended a calloused hand to Marcus. His grip was firm and honest, the handshake of a man who judged others by their willingness to meet his eyes and shake hands properly. "Tom Bradley," he said. "I run the Circle B Ranch, about 15 miles south of here. Jake Sullivan's a neighbor and a good man, though he's been carrying a heavy load lately." Marcus found himself grateful for the opportunity to speak with someone who actually knew Jake Sullivan personally. The more information he could gather about his potential employer, the better he could present himself when the time came to ask for work. "What's he like to work for?" Marcus asked, raising his voice as Tommy's crying reached new heights of indignation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The child seemed determined to announce his presence to everyone within a 5-mile radius. Tom glanced at the baby with the expression of someone who had raised children of his own and understood the challenges involved. His weathered face softened slightly as he watched Tommy's red-faced protest against the injustices of the world. "Jake's fair but demanding," Tom said thoughtfully. "Expects an honest day's work for an honest day's pay, and he's got no patience for laziness or excuses, but he'll stand by a man who proves himself reliable." He paused, his attention drawn momentarily to the window where Jasper had apparently decided the water trough needed closer inspection. The mule was now attempting to drink while simultaneously expressing his displeasure with the water's temperature, location, and general existence. "The thing is," Tom continued, returning his attention to Marcus, "Jake's ranch is no place for a baby. It's hard work from sunup to sundown, dangerous work sometimes, and there's no woman around to help with childcare. Emma used to handle the domestic side of things, but since she passed, it's been nothing but cowboys and cattle." Marcus felt his heart sink slightly. Every piece of information he gathered seemed to reinforce the same message that finding work while caring for Tommy would be nearly impossible. The child's needs conflicted with the demands of ranch work in ways that seemed insurmountable. "Still," Tom added, stroking his chin thoughtfully, "Jake's desperate enough for help that he might be willing to overlook the complications, provided you can prove you're worth the trouble." Martha nodded in agreement, her expression sympathetic as she watched Marcus struggle to calm the increasingly agitated child. Tommy's crying had reached the point where it was less about specific discomfort and more about general protest against his circumstances. "The best thing you could do," Martha suggested, "is ride out there and speak to Jake directly. He's not much for town visits these days, so if you want work at Cross Creek, you'll need to go to him." Marcus thanked both Martha and Tom for their advice, then gathered his few possessions and prepared to leave the store. Tommy had finally exhausted himself and settled into intermittent hiccuping sobs, though his small body still trembled with residual distress. Outside, Jasper had apparently concluded his investigation of the water trough and was now standing with his ears pinned back, radiating disapproval with the entire situation. The journey to Cross Creek Ranch would require several hours of travel across terrain that Marcus hoped would be navigable with a child and a reluctant mule. He had no saddle for Jasper, having sold it weeks ago for traveling money, which meant he would be walking the entire distance while carrying Tommy. The afternoon sun showed no signs of mercy, and the desert landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by occasional clusters of sagebrush and the distant promise of mountains. Marcus untied Jasper from the hitching post, noting with resignation that the mule had indeed managed to chew several splinters from the wood. He shouldered his pack, adjusted Tommy's position in his arms, and began walking northwest, following the directions Martha had provided. Behind him, Copper Ridge grew smaller with each step, until it resembled nothing more than a collection of weathered toys scattered across the desert floor. The road to Cross Creek Ranch was barely more than a pair of wagon ruts carved into the hardpan earth by years of occasional traffic. Dust rose with each footstep, coating Marcus's boots and pants with a fine layer of grit that would become his constant companion during the journey. Tommy had mercifully fallen asleep against his shoulder, the child's soft breathing providing a counterpoint to the rhythmic sound of footsteps and the occasional protest from Jasper. As they walked, Marcus found himself reflecting on the chain of events that had brought him to this desolate place. 3 months ago, he had been working as a stable hand in San Francisco, earning enough money to rent a small room and put food on the table. His sister Linda had been married to a good man named David, and they had been building a life together with little Tommy. The fever that took them both had struck with the swift cruelty of a prairie fire, leaving Marcus as the child's only living relative and forcing him to abandon his stable life in favor of an uncertain future. The decision to head east had been born of desperation and hope in equal measure. California cities offered few opportunities for a man with a child, especially one who lacked the education or connections necessary for clerical work. The frontier promised something different, though whether that something was opportunity or hardship remained to be seen. Jasper suddenly stopped walking, his hooves planted firmly in the dust and his expression suggesting that he had reached the limit of his cooperation for the day. Marcus tugged gently on the lead rope, but the mule remained immobile, as if his feet had grown roots into the desert floor. "Come on, Jasper," Marcus said quietly, mindful of the sleeping child in his arms. "We've still got miles to go before we reach the ranch." The mule's ears flicked forward and back, a gesture Marcus had learned to interpret as Jasper's way of expressing complex philosophical objections to human plans. After several minutes of patient coaxing, Marcus discovered that Jasper's protest was motivated by thirst rather than general stubbornness. A small creek crossed the road ahead, its water clear and cool despite the heat of the day. Marcus allowed Jasper to drink his fill while he sat on a fallen log beside the creek, adjusting Tommy's position so the child could continue sleeping comfortably. The sound of moving water was surprisingly peaceful after the constant noise of travel, and for a few minutes, Marcus allowed himself to simply rest and appreciate the brief respite from their journey. The creek meandered through a small grove of cottonwood trees, their leaves providing blessed shade from the afternoon sun. Marcus dipped his handkerchief in the cool water and used it to clean the dust from Tommy's face, marveling at how peaceful the child looked when he was not expressing his displeasure with the world. At 18 months, Tommy was beginning to develop his own personality, though that personality seemed to consist primarily of curiosity about everything and vocal objections to anything that interfered with his immediate comfort. When Jasper had finished drinking, and Marcus felt sufficiently rested, they resumed their journey toward Cross Creek Ranch. The afternoon was advancing, and Marcus hoped to reach his destination before sunset. Traveling unknown roads in the dark with a child and a mule struck him as an invitation for disaster, especially in country where rattlesnakes and other dangers might be lurking in the shadows. The landscape gradually began to change as they continued northwest. The flat desert gave way to rolling hills covered with grass that had somehow managed to survive the summer heat. In the distance, Marcus could see mountains rising like purple shadows against the sky, their peaks catching the late afternoon light. The air carried scents of sage and something else, something green and alive that spoke of water and growing things. As they crested a low hill, Marcus caught his first glimpse of Cross Creek Ranch, spread out in the valley below. The main house was a substantial structure built of local stone and timber, its architecture practical rather than ornate. A large barn dominated one side of the property, while a series of corrals and outbuildings suggested a working ranch of considerable size. Cattle dotted the surrounding pastures like dark punctuation marks against the golden grass, and somewhere in the distance, Marcus could hear the sound of men working with livestock. The sight filled him with both hope and apprehension. Cross Creek Ranch was clearly a successful operation, which meant Jake Sullivan would have high standards for anyone seeking employment. At the same time, the size of the spread suggested that there might indeed be enough work to justify hiring an additional hand, even one who came with complications. Tommy stirred in his arms as they began the descent toward the ranch buildings, the child's internal clock apparently sensing that their long journey was nearing its end. Marcus patted his bag gently, hoping to keep him calm for a few more minutes while he gathered his courage for the coming conversation with Jake Sullivan. Jasper, perhaps sensing that their destination was near, had actually begun to cooperate, walking with something approaching enthusiasm for the first time since leaving Copper Ridge. The mule's ears were pricked forward, and he seemed to be taking an interest in the horses visible in the ranch corrals. Marcus chose to interpret this as a positive sign, though he had learned not to trust Jasper's apparent cooperation too completely. As they approached the main yard of Cross Creek Ranch, a dog began barking from somewhere near the barn. The sound triggered an immediate response from Tommy, who woke up with a start and began crying again, his voice carrying clearly across the ranch yard. The crying, in turn, seemed to agitate Jasper, who began pulling against his lead rope and braying in apparent sympathy with the child's distress. The commotion of their arrival brought several men out of the barn to investigate. Marcus could see them pointing in his direction and speaking among themselves, though their words were lost in the combination of Tommy's crying, Jasper's braying, and the continued barking of the ranch dog. He felt his face flush with embarrassment as he realized that his arrival at Cross Creek Ranch was being announced by what sounded like a traveling circus of unhappy animals and children. One of the men detached himself from the group and began walking toward Marcus with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to dealing with disturbances. As he drew closer, Marcus could see that he was a man of perhaps 35 years, tall and lean, with the sun-weathered complexion of someone who spent his days outdoors. His clothes were practical working gear, worn but well-maintained, and his boots showed the scuffs and stains that came from serious ranch work. "Afternoon," the man said, his voice carrying easily over the noise. His eyes moved from Marcus to Tommy to Jasper with the quick assessment of someone who was used to evaluating situations rapidly. "I'm Jake Sullivan. This is my ranch. What can I do for you?" Marcus felt a moment of surprise at meeting Jake Sullivan so directly. He had expected to speak with a foreman or ranch hand first, not the owner himself. The realization that he was speaking directly with his potential employer added weight to the conversation and made Tommy's continued crying seem even more problematic. "Marcus Chen," he replied, shifting Tommy to his other arm in a futile attempt to calm the child. "I'm looking for work, sir. Heard in town that you might need an extra hand." Jake Sullivan's gaze lingered on Tommy for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he looked back at Marcus, there was something in his eyes that might have been sympathy, though it was quickly masked by the practical considerations of a ranch owner evaluating a potential employee. "You have experience with cattle?" Jake asked, his tone businesslike but not unfriendly. "Yes, sir. Worked cattle operations in California before heading east," Marcus replied, raising his voice to be heard over Tommy's increasingly loud protests. "No horses, too, and I'm willing to work hard." Jake nodded slowly, his attention momentarily drawn to Jasper, who had chosen that moment to investigate a nearby fence post with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient documents. The mule's behavior seemed to amuse him slightly, though his expression remained carefully neutral. "That your mule?" Jake asked. "Yes, sir. Name's Jasper. He's got his quirks, but he's strong and reliable when he needs to be," Marcus replied, hoping this was actually true. Jasper's reliability had been somewhat inconsistent during their journey, though the mule had never actually abandoned them entirely. Jake looked back at Tommy, who was now crying with the passionate intensity of someone who had been gravely wronged by the universe. The sound was beginning to attract attention from the other ranch hands, who were watching the conversation with obvious curiosity. "The thing is," Jake said carefully, "ranch work doesn't leave much time for tending to children. It's dangerous work sometimes, and we start before dawn and work until well after dark during busy seasons." Marcus felt his heart sink, recognizing the polite rejection that was coming. He had heard variations of the same speech in every town between California and Arizona, always delivered with varying degrees of sympathy, but always ending with the same result. "I understand, sir," Marcus began, preparing to thank Jake for his time and begin the long walk back to Copper Ridge. But Jake held up a hand, his expression thoughtful as he continued to study the unlikely trio of man, child, and mule standing in his ranch yard. "However," Jake continued, his voice taking on a different tone, "I am short-handed, and I'm facing some serious challenges with the fall roundup coming up. If you're willing to work hard and prove yourself useful, I might be willing to give you a trial period." Marcus felt a surge of hope that was immediately tempered by caution. Trial periods often meant working without pay while proving one's worth, and he had precious little money left to sustain himself and Tommy during such an arrangement. "What kind of trial period?" Marcus asked, bouncing Tommy gently in what was becoming an automatic gesture. Jake seemed to be weighing his words carefully, his gaze moving between Marcus and the child, as if calculating odds and possibilities. "There's an old line shack about a mile up the creek," he said finally. "It's not much, but it's got a roof and a stove, and it's close enough to the main ranch that you could bring the boy to work if necessary. Stay there for 2 weeks, help with whatever needs doing, and we'll see how things work out." The offer was more generous than Marcus had dared to hope for, though he recognized that it still represented a significant gamble for both of them. Jake Sullivan was taking a chance on an unknown man with obvious complications, while Marcus was betting his and Tommy's future on his ability to prove himself indispensable in just 2 weeks. "What about wages?" Marcus asked, knowing that the question might jeopardize the offer but needing to understand the practical realities of the arrangement. "If you work out, standard wages for a ranch hand," Jake replied. "If you don't, at least you'll have had a roof over your heads for 2 weeks and 3 meals a day." Marcus looked down at Tommy, who had finally begun to quiet down, his small face still red from crying but his sobs subsiding to intermittent hiccups. The child's dark eyes were wide as he took in the new surroundings, and Marcus wondered what kind of life he was choosing for both of them. "I appreciate the opportunity, Mr. Sullivan," Marcus said, extending his free hand. "We won't let you down." Jake shook his hand with a firm grip, though his expression remained cautious. "We'll see," he said simply. "Pedro," he called to one of the men near the barn. "Show Mr. Chen and his boy to the line shack. Help him get settled." As Pedro approached with a friendly smile and a stream of rapid Spanish directed at Jasper, who seemed oddly responsive to the new language, Marcus felt a complex mixture of relief, gratitude, and determination. He had found shelter and the possibility of work, but the real test was just beginning. 2 weeks to prove that a man with a crying child and a stubborn mule could earn his place on a working ranch. The sun was beginning to set behind the mountains as Pedro led them along a well-worn path that followed the creek toward the line shack. Tommy had settled into a watchful quiet, his small hands grasping at Marcus's shirt as they walked. Behind them, Jasper followed with unusual compliance, as if he too understood that their journey had reached a crucial point. The line shack proved to be a small but solid cabin built of logs and chinked with mud and moss. It had a single room with a stone chimney, a small table, and a narrow bed that had seen better days but appeared structurally sound. The roof showed no obvious signs of leaking, and the door closed properly, which made it significantly better than some of the accommodations Marcus and Tommy had shared during their travels. Pedro helped Marcus unload his few possessions and showed him where to find firewood, water, and basic supplies. The Mexican cowboy's English was limited but enthusiastic, and his genuine friendliness was the first unconditionally positive response Marcus had received since arriving in Arizona. "Jefe is good man," Pedro said, using the Spanish word for boss as he prepared to head back to the main ranch. "Work hard, he treat you fair." "No work hard." Pedro shrugged expressively, leaving the consequences to Marcus's imagination. As evening settled over Cross Creek Ranch, Marcus built a small fire in the cabin's stone fireplace and prepared a simple meal from the supplies Pedro had left. Tommy sat on the bed, playing with the wooden horse that had somehow survived their journey from California, his earlier distress apparently forgotten in the security of 4 solid walls and a warm fire. Outside, Jasper was making himself at home in a small corral that Pedro had shown them, though the mule's version of making himself at home involved systematic investigation of every fence post, water trough, and blade of grass within his reach. His thoroughness was impressive, even if his conclusions about the adequacy of his accommodations remained negative. As Marcus fed Tommy and prepared for their first night at Cross Creek Ranch, he found himself reflecting on the day's events and the opportunity that Jake Sullivan had offered. 2 weeks to prove himself was both more and less time than he had hoped for. More because it represented a genuine chance rather than an immediate rejection, less because establishing trust and demonstrating value in such a short period would require every skill he possessed, and probably some he had not yet discovered. The sound of men's voices carried across the ranch yard as the day's work concluded, and the cowboys returned to the bunkhouse for their evening meal. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed softly as they settled for the night, and the creek murmured its constant song as it flowed past the cabin. For the first time in weeks, Marcus allowed himself to feel something approaching optimism about their future. Tommy had fallen asleep against his shoulder, the child's breathing deep and regular in the way that only exhausted children could manage. Marcus tucked him into the cabin's narrow bed, arranging blankets to keep him warm and safe, then sat by the fire to plan for the days ahead. Tomorrow would bring his first full day of work at Cross Creek Ranch, his first opportunity to prove to Jake Sullivan that hiring a man with a child and a stubborn mule had been a wise decision rather than an expensive mistake. The challenges would be significant, but for the first time since leaving California, Marcus felt that he might have found a place where he and Tommy could build a life. Outside the cabin, Jasper released a long, mournful bray that echoed across the ranch yard like a commentary on the day's events. Marcus smiled despite himself, recognizing in the mule's vocalization the same mixture of uncertainty and determination that he felt about their new circumstances. The fire crackled softly in the stone chimney, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls as Marcus Chen settled in for his first night at Cross Creek Ranch, unaware that the next 2 weeks would test everything he thought he knew about survival, determination, and the unexpected ways that broken lives could be mended. Dawn arrived at Cross Creek Ranch with the sudden clarity that only the desert could provide, transforming the landscape from shadowy mystery to harsh reality in a matter of minutes. Marcus had been awake since before the first hint of light touched the eastern mountains, his internal clock adjusted to the demands of ranch life even before he had officially begun working. Tommy still slept peacefully in the narrow bed, his small form barely creating a ripple under the worn blankets, while outside the cabin Jasper could be heard expressing his morning opinions about the quality of hay in his corral. The sound of boots on the wooden porch announced Pedro's arrival before his gentle knock disturbed the morning quiet. Marcus opened the door to find the Mexican cowboy holding a steaming cup of coffee, and wearing the kind of smile that suggested either eternal optimism or complete ignorance of the challenges that lay ahead. "Buenos dias, amigo," Pedro said, offering the coffee with a flourish that would have been appropriate for presenting fine wine. "Jefe says you start with the horses today. Learn the remuda. See which ones you can handle." Marcus accepted the coffee gratefully, the bitter warmth cutting through the cool morning air and providing the first genuine comfort he had experienced in weeks. The liquid was strong enough to dissolve horseshoes and black as the midnight sky, exactly the kind of coffee that working men relied upon to transform themselves from sleeping creatures into functional human beings. "What time does Mr. Sullivan expect me?" Marcus asked, glancing back at Tommy, who had begun to stir but showed no immediate signs of waking completely. Pedro consulted an ancient pocket watch that had clearly seen better decades and probably better centuries. 30 minutes. Breakfast in the bunkhouse first, then work begins when the sun clears the ridge. The arrangement presented Marcus with his first practical challenge of ranch employment. Tommy would need to be fed, changed, and somehow entertained, while Marcus performed whatever tasks Jake Sullivan deemed appropriate for testing his capabilities. The child's schedule rarely aligned with the demands of adult responsibilities, and morning wake-ups were particularly unpredictable affairs that could range from cheerful cooperation to thunderous protests. "Is there somewhere safe I can bring Tommy while I work?" Marcus asked, hoping that Cross Creek Ranch might have accommodations for such complications. Pedro's expression grew thoughtful as he considered the question. "Old Maria, she cooks for the ranch. Maybe she helped with the niño during work time. She had many children, knows about babies." This represented more assistance than Marcus had dared to hope for, though he recognized that imposing on the ranch cook's generosity was hardly an ideal long-term solution. For the immediate challenge of proving himself during the next 2 weeks, however, Any help with Tommy's care would be invaluable. Tommy chose that moment to wake up completely, his transition from sleep to full consciousness, accompanied by the kind of vocal announcement that could wake sleeping cattle from distant pastures. Marcus hurried to attend to the child's morning needs while Pedro waited patiently outside, apparently accustomed to the unpredictable timing that children brought to any schedule. The walk to the main ranch complex revealed Cross Creek in the full glory of early morning activity. Cowboys were emerging from the bunkhouse with the deliberate movements of men whose bodies remembered yesterday's work while preparing for today's challenges. Horses in the corrals nickered softly as they caught the scent of hay and oats, while cattle in the near pastures began their daily migration toward water sources that would sustain them through another day of Arizona heat. The ranch kitchen occupied one end of the main house, its windows glowing with lamplight and its chimney releasing a steady stream of smoke that carried the promising aromas of bacon, coffee, and fresh biscuits. Marcus could hear voices and the clatter of plates from within, the sounds of men preparing for another day of demanding physical labor. Pedro led Marcus through the kitchen door, where he was immediately enveloped by warmth, wonderful smells, and the commanding presence of a woman who could only be old Maria. She stood perhaps 5 feet tall in her boots, but her authority over the kitchen domain was absolute and unquestionable. Her gray hair was pulled back in a severe bun that brooked no nonsense, and her dark eyes missed nothing as they surveyed Marcus and the bundle he carried. "So," she said in accented English that carried the weight of decades spent managing wayward cowboys, "you are the one who comes with the baby and the difficult mule." Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks as he realized that his arrival had already become common knowledge throughout the ranch. The combination of Tommy's crying and Jasper's theatrical protests had apparently provided entertainment for the entire crew during the previous evening's discussions. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Marcus Chen, and this is Tommy," he replied, adjusting the child in his arms as Tommy regarded Maria with the solemn intensity that babies reserved for new and potentially interesting adults. Maria approached with the confident stride of someone who had handled countless children during her lifetime. She studied Tommy with professional assessment, noting his alert expression, clean clothes, and general appearance of being well cared for despite their obviously difficult circumstances. "He is healthy, this one," she announced with approval. "Good eyes, good color. How old?" 18 months, Marcus replied, grateful for Maria's obvious expertise with children. "He's usually pretty good. But traveling has been hard on him." Maria nodded knowingly, her severe expression softening slightly as Tommy reached toward her with curious fingers. "Travel is difficult for the little ones. They do not understand why everything changes, why nothing stays the same." She gestured toward a wooden high chair that sat in one corner of the kitchen, clearly a relic from some previous era when children had been regular fixtures in the ranch house. "He can sit there while you work this morning. I keep an eye on him, make sure he does not get into trouble." The offer represented more kindness than Marcus had expected to encounter, and he found himself struggling to express adequate gratitude. Maria waved away his thanks with the brisk efficiency of someone who had no time for excessive sentiment during breakfast preparation. "Sit, eat," she commanded, pointing toward a long table where several cowboys were already working their way through substantial plates of food. "Growing men need food, and you look like you have not been eating enough lately." Marcus settled Tommy in the high chair, where the child immediately began exploring the wooden surface with the intense focus of a scholar examining important documents. The other cowboys nodded politely as Marcus joined them at the table, though their conversations continued without interruption. Ranch work left little time for extended social pleasantries, especially during the morning meal that needed to fuel a full day of physical labor. The food was simple, but abundant, the kind of hearty fare designed to sustain men who would be working in saddles and corrals until well after sunset. Marcus found himself eating with an appetite he had not experienced in weeks, his body recognizing the need to prepare for whatever challenges Jake Sullivan had planned for his first day of evaluation. Jake himself appeared just as the cowboys were finishing their meal, his presence commanding immediate attention without requiring any announcement. He moved through the kitchen with the quiet authority of a man who owned every inch of ground for miles around, his weathered face showing no particular expression as his gaze briefly touched Marcus, before moving on to survey the general readiness of his crew. "Morning, boys," Jake said, his voice carrying easily through the kitchen. "We've got cattle scattered from here to the territorial line, and the fall roundup starts whether we're ready or not. Pedro, take the new man and show him the horse herd. See what he knows about working with animals." Pedro nodded and rose from the table, indicating that Marcus should follow. As they prepared to leave, Jake's attention turned to Tommy, who had been watching the ranch owner with the unwavering stare that children used when trying to understand adult mysteries. "The boy stays here with Maria during work hours," Jake said, his tone making it clear that this was a statement rather than a suggestion. "Ranch work is dangerous enough without adding distractions." Marcus nodded his understanding in agreement, though he felt a familiar pang of anxiety about leaving Tommy with strangers. The child had been his constant companion for months, and separation, even for necessary work, felt like abandoning his most important responsibility. Maria seemed to sense his hesitation and moved to stand beside the high chair where Tommy sat contentedly exploring a wooden spoon she had provided. "Go," she said firmly. "Work hard. Show Chefe you are worth keeping. The baby will be safe." The morning air outside the kitchen carried the promise of another scorching day, though the early hours still held a coolness that made physical work tolerable. Pedro led Marcus toward a large corral where perhaps 30 horses moved, with the restless energy of animals that knew their daily routine was about to begin. "Remuda," Pedro explained using the Spanish term for the ranch's working horses. "Each cowboy has his own string, 5 or 6 horses for different kinds of work. You need to learn which ones you can handle, which ones will try to kill you." The horses represented a variety of breeds and temperaments, from compact quarter horses built for quick movements among cattle to larger animals suited for long-distance travel across rough terrain. Some bore the scars and careful movements that spoke of years of hard work, while others showed the eager energy of younger animals still learning their trade. Jake appeared beside the corral as Pedro began pointing out individual horses and explaining their particular characteristics. The ranch owner moved with the easy confidence of a man who had spent his entire adult life around livestock, his presence calming the horses, even as his attention remained focused on evaluating Marcus's reactions and questions. "Ever work with a cutting horse?" Jake asked, nodding toward a compact bay mare that stood slightly apart from the others, her intelligent eyes suggesting a mind that missed very little. "Some," Marcus replied carefully, knowing that claiming too much experience could be as dangerous as admitting ignorance. "Worked mostly with ranch horses in California, but I've seen cutting work done." Jake opened the corral gate and walked among the horses with the casual authority that marked an experienced horseman. The animals moved around him with respectful attention, neither crowding nor shying away, recognizing someone who understood their nature and treated them accordingly. "That's Bella," Jake said, approaching the bay mare with slow, deliberate movements. "Best cutting horse on the ranch, but she's particular about who she'll work with. If she accepts you, it says something about your character." Marcus understood that this represented his first real test, the beginning of Jake's evaluation of his worthiness as a ranch hand. Horses were notoriously accurate judges of human nature, and their acceptance or rejection often provided more reliable assessment than any amount of conversation or written recommendations. Pedro opened the gate wider, and Marcus entered the corral with the careful movements of someone who recognized that sudden gestures could spook animals and ruin any chance of establishing trust. The horses watched him with the alert attention they gave to any new presence in their domain, their ears pricked forward, and their eyes tracking his every movement. Bella stood her ground as Marcus approached, though her posture suggested she was reserving judgment about this stranger, who carried unfamiliar scents and moved with the slight tension of someone still establishing his place in the ranch hierarchy. Her nostrils flared slightly as she tested the air, gathering information about his intentions and character through senses that humans had largely forgotten how to use. "Easy, girl," Marcus said quietly, extending one hand palm down for her investigation. "Just want to get acquainted, see if we might be able to work together." The mare considered his offering with the gravity of a judge weighing evidence, her intelligent eyes studying his face as if searching for signs of dishonesty or bad intentions. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds, she stepped forward and allowed her nose to touch his hand, her breath warm against his palm as she gathered the scent information that would help her decide whether to trust him. Jake watched this interaction with the focused attention of someone whose livelihood depended on understanding the subtle communications between humans and animals. Pedro stood quietly beside the gate, his own experience telling him that speaking during such moments could disrupt the delicate process of establishing trust. Bella's acceptance, when it came, was gradual rather than dramatic. She allowed Marcus to stroke her neck, then her shoulder, her muscles relaxing slightly under his gentle touch. When he reached for the halter that hung on a nearby post, she stood quietly while he slipped it over her head, though her attention remained focused on his every movement. "She likes you," Jake observed, his tone neutral but his eyes showing a flicker of something that might have been approval. "That's more than she's done for most of the new men who've tried working with her." Leading Bella from the corral required patience and clear communication, as the mare needed to understand that Marcus could provide the kind of leadership she would respect. Horses, Marcus had learned during his years of working with them, were remarkably democratic in their willingness to follow, but they insisted on competent leadership, and would quickly challenge anyone who tried to bluff their way through a relationship. The morning's work involved familiarizing Marcus with the various horses in the remuda and evaluating his ability to handle different temperaments and skill levels. Some of the animals were steady, reliable creatures that would tolerate mistakes and inexperience, while others demanded the kind of expertise that came only from years of working with livestock. Pedro proved to be an excellent teacher, his broken English supplemented by gestures and demonstrations that conveyed more information than lengthy explanations might have provided. His patient guidance helped Marcus avoid several potentially dangerous situations while learning the individual quirks and preferences that made each horse unique. By mid-morning, the Arizona sun had begun to assert its dominance over the landscape, transforming the early coolness into the kind of heat that made every movement deliberate and every shadow precious. Marcus found himself grateful for the hat that Pedro had loaned him, its wide brim providing essential protection from the relentless glare that could quickly exhaust anyone foolish enough to work uncovered. The sound of a child crying drifted across the ranch yard from the direction of the main house, and Marcus felt immediate anxiety about Tommy's welfare. The crying could indicate anything from minor discomfort to serious distress, and being unable to respond immediately created a tension that interfered with his concentration on the morning's tasks. Jake noticed his distraction and nodded toward the house. "Go check on the boy," he said simply. A man can't work properly when he's worried about his child. Marcus appreciated both the permission and the understanding behind it, though he recognized that taking time away from work to attend to Tommy's needs was hardly going to strengthen his case for permanent employment. He handed Bella's lead rope to Pedro and hurried toward the kitchen, where he could hear Maria's voice mixing Spanish and English in what sounded like either conversation or gentle scolding. He found Tommy sitting in the high chair with tears streaming down his face, though the nature of his distress was not immediately apparent. Maria stood beside him with the patient expression of someone who had dealt with countless childhood crises during her long career of managing ranch households. "He is not hurt," Maria said, before Marcus could ask. "Just lonely for his papa, I think. Sometimes the little ones need to see the familiar face, to know they have not been forgotten." Marcus lifted Tommy from the high chair, and the child's crying immediately subsided into relieved sniffling. The weight of small arms around his neck and the familiar scent of baby hair provided comfort that Marcus had not realized he needed as much as Tommy did. "I'm sorry he's been trouble," Marcus said, bouncing Tommy gently while the child settled back into contentment. Maria waved away the apology with characteristic briskness. "Children are never trouble when they are loved. This one knows he is loved, which is why he trusts enough to cry when he needs comfort." The wisdom in her observation struck Marcus with unexpected force. During the long months of caring for Tommy alone, he had often felt overwhelmed by the constant demands and unpredictable needs that seemed to govern every aspect of their lives. Maria's perspective suggested that Tommy's willingness to express his needs was actually a sign of security rather than problematic behavior. "He can come with you this afternoon," Maria continued, reaching for a long strip of fabric that she began fashioning into a carrying sling. "I make this so you can work with hands free while keeping the baby close. Many ranch women use such things when children are small." The sling represented a practical solution that Marcus had not considered, though he recognized that working with Tommy strapped to his chest would present its own challenges and limitations. At the same time, it offered a way to keep the child close while demonstrating his commitment to the ranch work that Jake Sullivan required. Returning to the corrals with Tommy, secured in Maria's improvised sling, drew amused comments from Pedro and several other cowboys who had gathered to observe the new man's progress with the horses. The sight of a ranch hand working with a baby attached to his chest was apparently novel enough to provide entertainment, though the comments remained good-natured rather than mocking. "Pequeño vaquero," Pedro said with a grin, reaching out to let Tommy grasp his finger. "Little cowboy learns the business early." Tommy seemed fascinated by the horses and ranch activity, his dark eyes tracking the movement of animals and men with the intense attention that children brought to new experiences. The motion of Marcus's work appeared to soothe him, as if the rhythm of ranch life provided a comforting structure that he could understand even if he could not participate directly. Jake observed this arrangement with a thoughtful expression he brought to most ranch decisions, weighing practical considerations against human needs in ways that balanced efficiency with compassion. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of experience and careful judgment. "Afternoon work will be checking fence line in the east pasture," he announced. "Take the boy if you need to, but understand that ranch work comes first. If having him along interferes with getting the job done properly, we'll need to find another arrangement." Marcus nodded his understanding in agreement, recognizing that Jake's willingness to accommodate Tommy's presence represented significant flexibility for a working ranch. At the same time, the warning was clear. Proving himself valuable to Cross Creek Ranch would require demonstrating that he could handle both his responsibilities as a worker and his duties as a guardian, without allowing either to compromise the other. The afternoon sun beat down with the intensity that made Arizona summers legendary among those who worked outdoors for a living. Marcus rode a steady gelding named Buck, while carrying Tommy in the sling that Maria had fashioned, following a fence line that stretched across rolling hills toward distant mountains that shimmered in the heat like mirages. The work involved checking for breaks in the wire fencing, tightening loose sections, and replacing posts that had been damaged by weather, animals, or simple age. It was methodical, solitary labor that allowed Marcus to work at his own pace, while keeping Tommy comfortable and entertained. The baby seemed to enjoy the gentle motion of horseback travel, his eyes wide as he took in the vast landscape that surrounded Cross Creek Ranch. Occasionally he would point at something that caught his attention, babbling in the incomprehensible language that children use to communicate their observations about the world around them. As the afternoon progressed, Marcus found himself settling into the rhythm of ranch work in ways that felt both familiar and new. The basic skills translated well from his previous experience, but the scale and challenges of Cross Creek Ranch demanded adaptations and improvements that kept him fully engaged with the tasks at hand. The fence line led through terrain that varied from open grassland to rocky draws, where flash floods had carved deep channels through the desert soil. Some sections required dismounting to make repairs, which meant finding safe places to leave Buck while ensuring that Tommy remained secure and out of danger from tools or broken wire. By late afternoon, Marcus had completed the assigned section of fence and identified several areas that would require more extensive repairs than he could manage with the basic tools he carried. The work had been satisfying in the way that physical labor could be when it produced tangible results, and he felt cautiously optimistic about his performance during his first full day at Cross Creek Ranch. The ride back to the main ranch complex took him through pastures where cattle grazed in whatever shade they could find, their movements slow and deliberate in the heat that would not begin to ease until well after sunset. The animals represented the economic foundation of Jake Sullivan's operation, and their health and productivity would ultimately determine whether Cross Creek Ranch continued to prosper or struggle against the challenges that faced all frontier enterprises. Tommy had fallen asleep in the sling during the return journey. His small body relaxed against Marcus's chest in the complete trust that children showed when they felt secure. The weight of that trust had become both a comfort and a responsibility that shaped every decision Marcus made about their future. The ranch yard bustled with the controlled activity that marked the end of another working day. Cowboys were returning from various tasks, their horses showing the satisfied tiredness of animals that had earned their evening rest. The sounds of men and animals settling into evening routines created a symphony of peaceful productivity that spoke of work well done and rest well earned. Jake appeared as Marcus was unsaddling Buck and preparing to return the horse to the corral where he would spend the night. The ranch owner's expression was neutral, but his attention to the details of how Marcus cared for his mount suggested that horsemanship remained an important factor in his ongoing evaluation. "How did the fence work go?" Jake asked, running an experienced hand along Buck's legs to check for any signs of strain or injury from the day's travel. "Completed the east section as assigned. Marcus replied, shifting the sleeping Tommy to a more comfortable position. "Found 3 places that need more extensive repair work, and 1 spot where the wire is starting to rust through." Jake nodded, his approval evident in the way he continued his examination of Buck without urgency or concern. A horse returned in good condition spoke well of the man who had been responsible for its care during the day's work. "Tomorrow we start gathering cattle for the fall roundup," Jake said, his tone suggesting that this represented a significant escalation in the demands and expectations placed on Marcus's abilities. "Real ranch work, not just maintenance tasks. You'll need to prove you can handle yourself around cattle and work as part of a team." The challenge was clear, and Marcus understood that his trial period was entering a crucial phase. Fence repair and horse handling were important skills, but the core work of a cattle ranch involved the complex, dangerous, and demanding task of managing large herds of animals that possessed their own ideas about cooperation with human plans. "I'm ready," Marcus said, hoping that his confidence was not misplaced. "Whatever needs doing, I'll give it my best effort." Jake studied him for a long moment, his weathered face showing the kind of assessment that came from years of evaluating men under pressure. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of experience and careful judgment. "We'll see," he said simply. "The cattle will tell us what you're really made of." As evening settled over Cross Creek Ranch, Marcus carried the sleeping Tommy back to their line shack while reflecting on the day's accomplishments and challenges. He had survived his first day of work, earned cautious approval from Jake Sullivan, and managed to care for Tommy without creating major disruptions to ranch operations. The real test, however, was still to come. Cattle work would demand skills, courage, and teamwork that went far beyond the maintenance tasks he had handled during his first day. Success or failure during the roundup would determine whether Cross Creek Ranch became their new home or just another brief stop in their continuing search for a place where they could build a life together. Outside the cabin, Jasper greeted their return with a series of brays that seemed to comment on the day's events with typical mule skepticism. Marcus smiled as he listened to the familiar complaints, recognizing in Jasper's vocal protests the same mixture of uncertainty and determination that he felt about their prospects at Cross Creek Ranch. The first day had passed successfully, but 13 more remained in his trial period, and each would bring new challenges that would test everything he thought he knew about surviving on the frontier with a child and a stubborn mule as his only companions. The cattle roundup began before sunrise, with the kind of organized chaos that marked serious ranch work. Marcus found himself assigned to ride with Pedro and an older cowboy named Frank, their task to gather strays from the rocky canyons north of the main ranch. Tommy rode securely in Maria's sling, the child alert and watchful as they navigated the treacherous terrain where cattle often sought shelter from the desert heat. The work proved more challenging than anything Marcus had encountered during his trial period. Cattle hiding in brush-choked ravines required patience and skill to coax into the open, while the rocky ground tested both horse and rider with every step. Buck proved his worth as a steady mount, picking his way carefully through loose stones and steep inclines that could easily lame a less experienced animal. By midday, they had gathered nearly 40 head of scattered cattle, driving them toward the main herd that other crews were assembling in the valley below. The animals moved reluctantly in the heat, their natural stubbornness amplified by the discomfort of travel under the blazing sun. Dust clouds rose with every step, coating men and animals alike in a fine layer of grit that clung to sweaty skin and made breathing an exercise in endurance. Tommy had remained surprisingly calm throughout the morning's work, though the heat was beginning to take its toll on the small child. Marcus could feel the baby's increased restlessness and knew they would need to find shade and water soon, regardless of the work schedule. Pedro noticed his concern and gestured toward a grove of cottonwoods near the creek where they planned to rest the cattle before the final push to the holding pens. "Shade there, amigo. Little one needs cool water and rest." The brief respite allowed Marcus to care for Tommy while the cattle spread out along the creek bank, drinking deeply and seeking whatever relief they could find from the oppressive heat. Frank, a taciturn man who rarely spoke unless necessity demanded it, surprised Marcus by producing a piece of hard candy from his shirt pocket. "For the boy," Frank said gruffly, offering the sweet with the awkward kindness of someone unaccustomed to dealing with children. "Sugar helps in the heat sometimes." Tommy accepted the candy with the grave solemnity that children brought to unexpected gifts, though he seemed more interested in examining its wrapping than actually eating it. The gesture marked a small but significant acceptance by the ranch crew, suggesting that Marcus and his unconventional circumstances were gradually finding their place in the Cross Creek family. Jake appeared on horseback as they prepared to move the cattle for the final push to the holding pens. His weathered face showed the strain of coordinating multiple crews across miles of difficult terrain, but his attention remained focused on the details that could make the difference between success and disaster. "How's the new man working out?" Jake asked Pedro, though his eyes remained on Marcus as he spoke. "Bueno," Pedro replied simply. "Knows cattle, knows horses. The baby, he is no trouble today." Jake nodded slowly, his gaze taking in the way Marcus had positioned himself to help control the herd while keeping Tommy secure and comfortable. The sight of a cowboy working effectively with a child strapped to his chest was clearly novel, but results spoke louder than conventional appearances. "Finish bringing them in," Jake said. "We'll sort and brand tomorrow, then start moving them to winter pasture." The afternoon's drive tested every skill Marcus possessed, and several he had to develop quickly. Cattle that had been cooperative near the creek became fractious and unpredictable as they were pushed away from water toward unfamiliar surroundings. Several animals attempted to break away from the herd, requiring quick responses from riders who had to anticipate where the runaways would go and position themselves to turn them back. Tommy seemed to sense the increased tension and excitement, his small hands gripping Marcus's shirt as Buck responded to the subtle pressure of reins and legs that guided him through the complex dance of herding cattle. The baby's eyes tracked the movement of animals and riders with fascination, as if understanding that he was witnessing something important and dramatic. By late afternoon, they had successfully delivered their portion of the herd to the main holding area, where several hundred cattle milled about in clouds of dust and confusion. The sight represented the culmination of days of careful planning and hard work, transforming scattered animals into a manageable group that could be processed and moved according to the ranch's needs. Marcus dismounted near the corral fence, his legs trembling slightly from hours in the saddle, and the constant tension of managing both horse and child during demanding work. Tommy had fallen asleep against his chest, exhausted by the day's excitement and heat, his small face peaceful despite the chaos surrounding them. Jake approached as Marcus was loosening Buck's cinch, the ranch owner's expression thoughtful as he surveyed the results of the day's roundup. The successful gathering of cattle represented both an operational necessity and a test of his crew's abilities, including the newest member who had arrived with unusual complications. "You did good work today," Jake said simply, his words carrying more weight than elaborate praise might have provided. "Handled yourself well. Kept the boy safe. Didn't slow down the operation." Marcus felt a surge of relief and cautious pride at the acknowledgement. 2 weeks of trial work had tested his abilities in ways he had not anticipated, forcing him to balance the demands of ranch employment with the responsibilities of caring for a small child. The fact that Jake considered his performance satisfactory suggested that permanent employment might be within reach. "Thank you, sir," Marcus replied. "Cross Creek is good work, good people. Tommy and I appreciate the chance you gave us." Jake studied the sleeping child with an expression that Marcus could not quite interpret. Something in the ranch owner's weathered features suggested thoughts and memories that went beyond the immediate practical considerations of hiring decisions. "The boy reminds me of someone," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that spoke of old grief carefully controlled. "Same dark hair, same way of looking at everything like it's worth understanding." The comment revealed more about Jake Sullivan's inner life than Marcus had learned during his entire trial period. The ranch owner's reputation for keeping his own counsel and avoiding personal revelations made this glimpse into his thoughts both unexpected and significant. "Your son?" Marcus asked gently, recognizing that he was treading on painful ground but sensing that Jake needed to share whatever burden he was carrying. Jake nodded slowly, his gaze distant as he watched the settling dust of the roundup. "Emma and I, we lost a baby boy about Tommy's age. Fever took him one winter when the doctor couldn't get through the snow. That was before we lost Emma, too." The revelation explained much about Jake's initial reluctance to accept Marcus and Tommy, as well as his gradual warming toward the child who had become such a visible part of daily ranch operations. Caring for Tommy had forced Jake to confront memories and emotions that he had worked hard to suppress during his years of solitary grief. "I'm sorry for your losses," Marcus said, understanding now why the sight of a healthy, thriving child might be both painful and healing for a man who had buried his own family. Jake straightened his shoulders. the gesture marking a return to the practical concerns that governed ranch life. Whatever emotional territory they had briefly explored was being carefully closed off again, though something fundamental had shifted in the relationship between employer and employee. "Your trial period ends tomorrow," Jake said, his tone businesslike but not unfriendly. "You've proven yourself capable, and the crew has accepted you. If you want permanent work at Cross Creek, the job is yours." The offer represented everything Marcus had hoped for during their long journey from California, though he recognized that accepting would mean committing himself and Tommy to a life that would always involve the challenges of frontier ranching. At the same time, Cross Creek Ranch had provided them with something they had not found elsewhere, a community that accepted their unconventional circumstances and judged them by their contributions rather than their complications. "I'd be honored to stay," Marcus replied. "Cross Creek feels like home for both of us." Jake extended his hand, and they shook, with the firm grip that sealed agreements between men who understood the value of their word. The gesture marked not just the completion of a successful trial period, but the beginning of a new chapter for both the ranch and the small family that had arrived with nothing but determination and hope. As evening settled over the ranch, Marcus carried the sleeping Tommy back to their cabin while reflecting on the day's events and the security that permanent employment would provide. Maria had already prepared a celebration dinner for the crew, and the sound of voices and laughter from the main house spoke of men who had earned their rest through honest labor. Outside the cabin, Jasper greeted their return with his usual commentary on the day's events, though his complaints seemed less pointed than usual. Even the stubborn mule appeared to sense that their wandering days were over, replaced by the routine and security of a permanent home. The next morning brought official confirmation of Marcus's new status as a permanent member of the Cross Creek crew. Jake made the announcement during breakfast, his words brief but carrying the authority that made such decisions final and binding. "Marcus Chen is staying on as a regular hand," Jake told the assembled cowboys. "He's proven himself during the trial, and the ranch can use his skills." The crew's acceptance was immediate and genuine, marked by handshakes, backslapping, and the kind of ribbing that indicated full membership in the ranch family. Pedro seemed particularly pleased, having served as Marcus's unofficial mentor during the difficult period of proving himself worthy of permanent employment. Maria presented Marcus with a leather vest that had belonged to the previous foreman, its worn surface speaking of years of hard use by someone who had understood the demands of ranch work. The gift represented more than simple practicality. It marked his official transition from temporary help to permanent member of the Cross Creek community. "Now you look like real vaquero," Maria said with satisfaction, adjusting the vest's fit while Tommy watched from his high chair with bright-eyed interest. "The baby! He grows up to be cowboy too, maybe." The prospect of Tommy growing up on Cross Creek Ranch filled Marcus with a contentment he had not experienced since before his sister's death. The child would have stability, community, and the kind of childhood that involved horses, cattle, and the endless horizons that defined life in the Arizona territory. Winter preparations began immediately, with Marcus taking on increased responsibilities that reflected his new permanent status. The work involved moving cattle to protected pastures, repairing buildings and equipment that would need to withstand harsh weather, and laying in supplies that would sustain the ranch through months when travel became difficult or impossible. Tommy thrived in the ranch environment, his development accelerated by constant exposure to new experiences, and the attention of adults who had grown genuinely fond of the determined child, who had arrived crying but stayed to become part of their extended family. Maria doted on him with the affection of a grandmother, while the cowboys competed to teach him words in both English and Spanish. As the first snows began to dust the distant mountains, Marcus found himself settled into routines that felt both challenging and sustainable. Cross Creek Ranch had provided exactly what he had hoped to find during their long journey from California: honest work, fair treatment, and a place where he and Tommy could build a life together. Jake Sullivan had grown into something approaching a father figure for Tommy, though he maintained the careful emotional distance that protected him from the pain of old losses. Still, Marcus often caught him watching the child with expressions that suggested healing of wounds that had seemed permanent. One evening, as snow fell gently outside the ranch house windows, Jake made an announcement that surprised everyone gathered around Maria's dinner table. "Come spring, we'll be adding a schoolroom to the main house," he said quietly. "Time this ranch had proper facilities for the children who live here." The statement acknowledged what everyone had come to understand. Tommy was no longer a temporary complication, but a permanent part of Cross Creek Ranch, deserving of the same consideration and planning that went into any other aspect of ranch operations. Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion as he realized the full significance of Jake's announcement. The man who had lost his own family was ensuring that Tommy would have every opportunity to grow and thrive in the community that had accepted them both. Outside, Jasper's evening bray echoed across the snow-covered ranch yard, a sound that no longer seemed like complaint, but rather like a contented acknowledgement of home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.